Hello, I'm George from Ireland. This is a video about what's going on in Afghanistan. In case you don't know, Afghanistan's an Asian landlocked country. It borders Pakistan to the east, Iran to the west, to the north, three former Soviet republics, Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan and Tajikistan. All those five so far are Muslim countries. It has a tiny border with China and arguably has a border with India, depending on whether you consider Jammu and Kashmir part of India. So almost every Afghan now is a Muslim. The non-Muslim communities are mostly part of the country. 90% of Afghans are Sunni Muslims. About 10% are Shia Muslims. So Afghanistan is divided into several indigenous ethnic linguistic groups. So Dari is the major language of the country, spoken by about 50% of the people. And so a preponderance of the Dari speakers are in the western half of the country, and Dari is really the same language as Persian, which is the language of Iran. The other major ethnic linguistic group are the Pathans, who speak the Pashto language, and they're the majority in the south and the east of the country, bordering Pakistan. The border of Pakistan is called the Durand Line, after the Briton who drew it in the 19th century. It's a fairly porous border. The other major ethnic groups are Tajiks, as in the same people as in Tajikistan, same language, and they speak something very close to Persian. The Uzbeks, same ethno-linguistic group as live in Uzbekistan, and Turkmen, the same ethno-linguistic group as in Turkmenistan. There are a number of minor other ones. So the 10% of Afghans who are Shia Muslims are the Hazaras, and they speak the Dari language, i.e. Persian. The Taliban has been around since the early 90s, and it is an Islamic fundamentalist organization. So grew out of some of those people who fought against the Soviet army in Afghanistan. Some of those who resisted the Soviet army as part of the Mujahideen became anti-Taliban. So the Taliban is strongly associated with the Pathan ethno-linguistic group, and the Pathans are themselves subdivided into various clans, each with their own chieftain. They're shifting alliances between them. Not every Pathan supports the Taliban. Some of the Taliban would like independence for a Taliban homeland, which would be in the Khyber Pakhtunkhwa province of Pakistan, as well as in the eastern half of Afghanistan. So others don't want that. So the Turkmen, Uzbek and Tajik people tend to be against the Taliban. The Hazaras are dead against it because the Taliban are Sunni and indeed viciously anti-Shia, previously tried to annihilate the Shia, whom they considered to be heterodox Muslims. The Afghan government is made up of a number of political parties, and it's still the Islamic Emirate of Afghanistan is still sort of observant. The laws still reflect Islam. I remember notably over 10 years ago, an Afghan man was sentenced to death for converting to Christianity, but they then judged him insane and allowed him to move to Italy. But, it's much more liberal than it used to be under the Taliban, because, of course, the Taliban ruled from the early 90s to about 2001. See, the Taliban was the most oppressive government of all time, banning even music, kite flying, women showing their face in public, television, most sports, and on, films, virtually any form of entertainment or leisure. Just lashings and public execution were the only forms of public entertainment. But anyway, so NATO intervened after 9/11 in 2001. The United States invoked that charter that article of the NATO charter saying an attack on one is an attack on all. You will have to come and help us. So all the other 20-odd NATO countries dispatched troops to Afghanistan to assist the United States there. Several countries that are not in NATO, such as Ukraine and Georgia, they also sent troops to help. But so the Taliban, they were pushed to the margins of Afghanistan. They often hopped over to the border into Pakistan, from which they drew succor. So the Inter-Services Intelligence, that's ISI, that's Pakistan's secret service agency, they assisted the Taliban. They and helped them a lot in the 90s, but Pakistan had limited control over the Taliban. The Taliban's more of a movement than an organization. It's not very united, and it has a commander of the faithful, but again, he can't properly control the Taliban. So some of the Taliban were reconcilable to compromise, others were not open to it. Afghanistan's also the world's biggest single producer of heroin, which funds the Taliban, and it's really its only major export. It's virtually bereft of natural resources. It's mostly desert and mountain, and this is one of the cruel ironies that so much blood and treasure has been spilt over one of the poorest countries in the world. Anyway, so the Taliban, they managed to come back, take over more and more districts, and finally, as they calculated, NATO grew jaded this campaign, wasn't fully committed to it, wasn't willing to have that many of its people killed. NATO lost several thousand soldiers and so on. Most of them were Americans, whereas the Afghan army lost tens of thousands of men, the Taliban probably even more. So some Taliban were very, very poor. They're talking about the $10 Taliban paid $10 a month to fight. So often they could seek refuge in Pakistan. There were American drone strikes in Pakistan, which were semi-effective. So Pakistan was playing a double game over the Taliban for a long time, even though the Taliban carried out many terrorist attacks in Pakistan and killed many civilians there. I mean, Pakistan, some people are very pro-Taliban and a few are very anti it, particularly the Shia minority. Anyway, so NATO is packing its bags. Has it achieved anything? Well, Afghanistan has improved remarkably in the last 20 years. The infrastructure has improved, women's rights has improved. It's gone sort of centuries forward. Well, really, in a way, it's back to what it had in the 1970s when it was fairly liberal, and is more prosperous than it used to be. The Taliban has also moderated, sees why it was unpopular, that people have got used to being able to watch television, listen to the radio, play sports, and they've had to tone down some of their policies. The Islamic world has moved forward, has made headway in 20 years. Even Saudi Arabia is allowing women to drive, has allowed cinemas since the first time since the early 80s, has allowed some voting and things like that. So the Taliban's had to move with that. Remember, Saudi Arabia and Pakistan were some of the only countries that recognised the Taliban as the rightful government of Afghanistan way back in the 1990s. But the Afghan army couldn't crush the Taliban, even with huge NATO assistance. Without NATO assistance, the Afghan army hasn't got a prayer. The US date for the final withdrawal is the 11th of September this year, ironically the 20th anniversary of the 9/11 attacks. Now, already the great bulk of US forces have pulled out of the country. It's had difficulty removing some of its equipment, and there was talk of trying to get another US base in the region. Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, or Turkmenistan, would they permit the United States to have bases there? They did in the early years after 9/11, when, of course, Russia had quite a cordial relationship with the United States, was cooperating with the United States on this issue. But Russia doesn't want that now. China is much more influential in the region. The Americans realise they can't displace Russia or China as the hegemon in that region. Do they even want to? These regions produce oil and gas, but America can get that elsewhere, and it's not worth intervening. So the US is going to leave behind 600 Marines for its embassy. That's its biggest Marine guard contingent at any embassy. And some Turkish soldiers are going to guard the airport, being Muslims thought to be more acceptable to the Taliban. But the Taliban has insisted that all NATO troops withdraw. But so far the US is not agreeing to that. But Afghan provinces have been falling to the Taliban like ninepins over the last few weeks, and people see which way the wind is blowing. There's been a bit of sauve-qui-peut amongst the Afghan army, and the devil take the hindmost, fleeing to the northern frontier. The Uzbeks and the Tajiks have let them in. The Turkmens have not, and the Turkmens have done that partly because then you've got to stand and fight. It's your only chance of survival. Now, Turkmenistan is one of the cruelest tyrannies in the world. It's a Central Asian equivalent to North Korea, with its demented cult of the personality for its leader, Gurbanguly Berdimuhamedov, who is very much a secular person in a country that's overwhelmingly Muslim, very much distrusts observant Muslims, anyone who grows a beard and so forth. But curiously, he has the best relationship with the Taliban of anybody in the region, because his deal is non-interference. You will let me viciously oppress my people, and I'll let you do the same, but you just don't poke your nose into my affairs, and I will not poke my nose into your country's business. And the Taliban seem to have accepted that for now. You know, Uzbekistan and Tajikistan, they're both authoritarian countries, and so the only opposition kind of could be the mosque, but they've got very vigilant secret services who are highly suspicious of anyone who's a practicing Muslim. One of my friends from Uzbekistan told me that her brother in his 30s had got more into his faith, starting to go to the mosque on a daily basis, but her mother pleaded with the brother not to because he might be arrested. So, as in the Soviet days, all religious buildings in these countries are owned by the government, and the religious community can use these for their prayer activities, so long as they don't irk the government. If they do, then that building will be confiscated and they shan't be allowed to use it for worship. Anyway, so, and some, of course, Uzbeks, Turkmens, and Tajiks have crossed the border to join the Taliban, although that's unusual for their ethnicity. Anyway, so the Taliban is taking over. It's very blatant to me. There was a possibility that they would strike a deal and have some sort of coalition with the other parties, but why should they make concessions when they're winning anyway? And it seems the United States wants to get out at all costs. You know, there is now some vacillation in Western chancelleries. Is it wrong to pull out? But the West has gone too far down this road. It's not going to go back in. They feel they accomplished little in 20 years for all their sacrifice. There's absolutely no public appetite for more Oriental adventures. Afghanistan has a richly deserved reputation as the graveyard of empires, whether it's for Alexander the Great or the British Empire, or well, perhaps the Sikh Empire, or to some extent the Mughal Empire, the Soviet Empire, and now indeed the American Empire. But it doesn't necessarily bring these empires down, but it was capable of defeating various countries, even at the zenith of their military might. So the Taliban is taking over. So we're not completely winding the clock back 20 years. Some progress has been made. You say there'd be a peace dividend. Well, one of it would be TAPI, Turkmenistan, Afghanistan, Pakistan, India pipeline. That gas pipeline would benefit everyone. Everyone's a winner. And the Taliban for the last few years have allowed it to be constructed across the territory that they control in return for payments. So it's in everybody's interest that this should go ahead. Now, the Chinese are Pakistan's closest ally. The Chinese are worried about Taliban influence to spread into Xinjiang province, where they have a Muslim community, but they are dispersing funds to the Pakistanis, who are then going to hand it on to Afghanistan for redevelopment, but that's going to be subject to the proviso that the Taliban doesn't do anything to irritate China, or China will hit back very hard. The Chinese got a military base in Tajikistan, for instance. They got another one in Kyrgyzstan. They all might actually be not a peace dividend, but it'll be peace loss, because there'll no longer be so many soldiers, journalists, NGOs there spending money. But that's overwhelmingly in Kabul, so some people are going to lose out. A lot of Taliban, of Afghans who can, are going to get out. They're going to flee like smoke before the wind as the Taliban are coming to town. So they might have to put their headscarves on, if not actually the full veil. So I think it's not going to go quite all the way back to the Middle Ages, but it will go half of the way back. And really, I don't see a Western intervention happening, almost how bad it goes. The Taliban may have also learnt their lesson that really terrorist attacks in Western countries are a bad idea, because they paid a very heavy price for that. So they can do what they want so long as they keep it within their country, just non-interference. This is a headache from Iran, which is allies of the Hazara Shia minority there, because 90% of Iranians are Shia. They are a hereditary enemy of the Taliban. And then Pakistan is a bit worried. It can't get off the tiger's back. It will end up inside, as John F. Kennedy would say. The Taliban might be buoyed up by their success, want to take over Pakistan. They've assassinated various Pakistani politicians before. The former Prime Minister, Benazir Bhutto. They tried it with the quondam president, Pervez Musharraf. Despite his highly ambiguous relationship with them, there's certainly elements of the Pakistani military and the ISI which are genuinely ideologically committed to the Taliban's cause. So that's what's going to happen. In a confidential US report, it was leaked a while ago, they estimate that within 6 months of the US withdrawal, the Taliban will control the whole country. It's not a foregone conclusion. After the Soviets withdrew, the Afghan Communist government held Kabul for a surprisingly long time. Everyone thought they collapsed like that, but that they held on for about 4 years. Anyway, that's enough from me, so please make sure you subscribe to my channel. Goodbye.